Hello and welcome to E333. I'm your instructor, Gregory Myers. In this video, we're going to take another look at our user class as part of our Fundamentals Demo series. And particularly, we're going to focus on a little bit of file I/O, particularly file output. The idea being that we want to save the state of our user objects, potentially by saving them to the file system in a .csv or comma separated values file, so that ultimately then we can import them later on. The idea being here that we're going to leverage some of the methods that we have in our user class, particularly the toCSV method that allows for us to then format the output in a way that we can then ultimately store it on the file system or potentially print it to the command line. But basically what we want to do is we want to capture the information about our users such that when we close our application, that we can then later on come back to the information without having to re-enter it. Particularly to note here that this video assumes that you have already looked at our discussion about static attributes as well as static methods. And we've also added, if you notice here, the status of our user object, and it is an enum which you can add different properties. We have different enums to it. So in this case, we have a dirty enum, which simply means that the object is not completely constructed. We also have a active and inactive, which says whether the user is actually active in our system, and so on. What we want to do, though, is we want to focus on this static variable, this array list users, and we're going to ultimately utilize it in the next few videos to be able to do things like write all of our users to a file. But we're going to start simple. We're going to keep it simple. We're going to focus on a single user here. And so the first thing that we want to do is we want to come down here to our toString method, and we simply want to add to the toString method the status. And in this case, it's going to be this dot status dot toString, and you also have the option of name. That's going to be the friendly name, but I would suggest that you use the toString method, and then you simply, in this case for the toString, you simply append then a new line onto each one of the fields. For the toCSV, we want to remove the new line on what would ultimately be the fourth column. We want to replace it with a comma. And then for the fifth line, we once again want to, or excuse me, fifth element, fifth column here, we ultimately want to add this dot status dot toString and follow that up with our new line. So at this point then, we've done all we need to do inside of our user.java. So now we want to turn our attention to the fundamentals.java, and what we're going to do now is we're going to leverage a new function that we're going to call fileDemo. Particularly this one's going to focus on file output. And what you're going to see is that file output is a little different in Java than it is in C. Particularly, you're going to discover that you're going to need two, or for convenience, you're going to need two different objects. And one is going to be the java.util.file, or rather the, java.io.file. And we're just going to simply call this variable output file. We're not going to initialize it yet. And then we're also going to have a java.io.fileWriter. We're going to take a look and we're going to see that there are actually quite a few different classes that we're going to use in this particular package. And we're going to call this one output fileWriter. Now, we could technically initialize the output file, but you're going to see that when you initialize the output fileWriter, you actually have to use a try-catch block. And to see what I'm talking about, I'm just going to attempt now to take our output fileWriter, and I'm going to initialize it using new java.io .filewriter, and I'm just going to put in the file name sample.csv. Now, you'll notice that you get an error that says basically that exception must be caught or declared to be thrown. In other words, the method either has to handle the exception itself, or it has to state explicitly that it's going to throw any exception to whichever function then called, in this case, the method fileDemo. We'll get an opportunity to dig deeper into this later, but for right now, this is our first foray into the exceptions in Java, and you'll see that they're going to be quite useful in trapping unexpected errors. So to begin with, what we want to do is we want to build our try-catch block, and specifically what we're going to do is we're just going to catch a general exception. We're not going to focus necessarily on the IO exception yet, but what we'll do is we'll move any of our code into the try part of the try-catch block, with the idea being here that we're going to simply output using our system.out.println whatever the toString is for our exception. So basically, we'll get information about where the error might occur. You can take a look also at the exception, and you'll see that there are other fields, including the ability to print out the stack trace and so on. Now, we are not going to use this single line approach here, and the reason for it being is we're actually going to use this, I guess you could sort of call it this convenience object of this output file of type java.io.file, and you'll see later on that that convenience object allows for us to do things like check to see if a file exists before we attempt to open it. So essentially what we're going to do is a two-step approach here. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and initialize our output file. So java.io.file. And we're still going to go ahead and use or hard code our CSV file. As a matter of fact, I'm going to go ahead and just call this one users.csv. And the second step that we want to do here is going to be our output file writer. And when we initialize this using the java.io.filewriter constructor, you'll see that one of the overloads accepts a file object. So in this case, instead of hard coding the file name into the fileWriter constructor, we use the output file object that we just created. This is essentially the same concept now as what you would have had with your file pointer in C, so that you want to make sure that when you open the file, you also go ahead and take a second to remember to close it before you forget here. So output file writer dot close. Now, the analogy is not 100% perfect between C and Java, and we'll see exactly how this works. You're actually going to see that Java is a little richer in its capabilities with respect to file IO. But at this point, what we want to do is we simply want to create now a user and attempt to write it to a file. The other thing that you want to take a second to do is you want to go ahead and pull up the Java doc on both the file writer, as well as take a second to understand how the Java exceptions work. So I'm going to provide you a couple of these links here. Particularly here is the documentation for the file writer. You'll see that it inherits from the output stream writer, which inherits from writer, and so on. And so basically files aren't the only things that you can write to is one way to look at it. And you'll see there's our constructors, there's the one that we're currently using, and you also have an overload that specifies whether you want to append to a given file object. And so we're going to play around with this one in just a second, because what you're going to see is without this, you're essentially overwriting the file. As well as you'll see that there is the overload that simply allows for you to specify the file name directly. Although I'm going to discourage us from using this approach, there's nothing wrong with it. The second thing to point out is the Java documentation for the exception, and you'll notice that it sits in java.lang.exception. You can see all of the different types of exceptions, and we'll come back to these as well. But the main thing that I wanted to point out here is that you have the ability then to get additional information from a particular exception, and also the methods associated with it, not the least of which is simply the toString. All right, so let's go back to this real quick. We're going to make one quick change here. We're going to try to encourage keeping the full package path here. So in this case, for the exception, it's going to be java.lang.exception. As you get more familiar with the Java programming language, you don't necessarily have to do that. But what we want to do now is we want to create a new user object. So in this case, then it's going to be ee333.user. We're just going to simply call this one user A, but we are not, in fact, going to initialize it. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to use the java.util.scanner, and we're going to create a new scanner. And basically what this is going to allow for us is to interactively gather the information from the user. So remember, for the input argument for this, it's going to be your system.in. So we now have a scanner object that allows for us to simply read the information from the command lines, which means that we want to prompt the user for the information, the first name, the last name, the ID, the age, and so on, which means that we're going to go ahead and need some temporary variables in here. So to begin with, what we want to do is we'll have our string for the first name, and we can go ahead and initialize it just simply to empty quotes. We also want to have a string for the last name. Probably the most important one, of course, is the ID. We can get around to auto-generating this later. And the integer for the age, which we're going to just initialize as 0. And then we don't want to forget the ee333.user.status. But remember that we ultimately want our constructor to set this. So you can decide later if, for instance, you want to be able to set the user status. We're just going to go ahead and set, in this case, the user status to, or the value for the status here, in this case, to ee333.user.status.active, because we want to go ahead and make sure that our user is active after we've created them. And so what you do here is you simply have pairs now of system.out.print lines with things like, please enter the ID, followed by, in this case, our scanner. And what we want to do here is we want to leverage the next string. Give me 1 second here. By simply capturing, I think I went past it here. Where is it? Oh, there it is. Sorry, went right past it. Didn't mean to do that. So we'll capture the information using the scanner.next. And in this case, we're just going to go ahead and capture and store it in the ID. We do the same thing now, system.out.println. Please enter the first name. And it's going to be first name equal to sc.next. Likewise, system.out dot print line. Please enter the last name. And then we come now to the age, so system.out.println. Please enter the age. And then age is just simply going to be equal to sc.nextInt. And one of the advantages of putting this inside of a try-catch block is that any exceptions that are thrown here are going to be caught by the catch here, okay, and we'll see what they are. So rather than just focus on the IO exceptions, we're going to just catch any exception in this particular case. And now at this point, assuming that all of the information's been gathered, we can simply say user A is going to be equal to new EE333 dot user, and we can use either of the constructors or any of the three constructors here. In this case, since we've got all the information, we can go ahead and provide it all at once. Which now brings us to what we ultimately wanted to do. And that was we wanted to be able to store the information in a file. And this is where that toString and that toCSV method come into play, because the toCSV method then simply returns back to us a string that is already in the proper format. And all we have to do, I'll leave this here for just a second, commented out, all we have to do is use our output file writer, and we just want to look through the methods real quick to see which function we want to leverage here. So you'll see there's an append using a character sequence. There's also an append for a single character. But if you come down here, you'll see that you have your write methods, and your write methods will allow for you to write a string to an open file, in this case, an open file writer. So in this case, the most logical one that we want to use is just simply going to be our write method. And at this point, what we want to do is we simply write the user A dot to CSV. And it's as simple as that. So at this point, what we want to do is go ahead and verify that our application will in fact build. So we'll do a build on it. I'm not seeing my output window here. For some reason that's disappeared. Let's see what's going on here. There we go. Didn't mean to close that. And then what we want to do is come up here to our main, and we simply want to allow for the user to pass the correct switch here to allow us to run our file demo. So in this case, then what we want to do is an else if args.length equal to 1. And args square brackets 0 dot equals ignore case matches our file demo. Now we're going to come back and we'll ultimately add some additional demos here. We can also allow for the user in the future to pass the information parametrically on the command line using additional arguments. But for right now, we're going to keep this simple by just simply calling our file demo. And let's go ahead and build it. Let's go ahead and jump out to the command line. We're going to cd to the documents, courses, EE333, projects, my fundamental demos. At this point, do a dir, and you'll see there's my build directory and my classes subdirectory, and there's my EE333. And so what we want to do is we simply want to run our EE333 fundamentals driver. That's the class that we'll ultimately have our main in. And we want to provide to it the fileDemo switch. And you'll see that I am now being prompted for the ID. I'm going to go ahead and use my email address. So there's G. Myers. Please enter the first name, Gregory. Please enter the last name, Myers. We'll put the age in here. And if you do a dir now, you'll see nothing's changed. If you look into the EE333 folder, you'll see that nothing has changed yet. And so what we want to do now is we want to figure out what happened to our file. So the first thing, let's go ahead and jump out to Explorer real quick. And you'll notice that it sits in the same directory as our users, users.csv sits in the same directory that we launched the Java from, okay? So in this case, since we were in our build folder, you'll see there is the classes subfolder. So if we drill down into the classes subfolder, you'll see there is users.csv. Okay, so it's basically, it's where we would have launched our Java. So take a look here. It's where we would have launched this. Now, let's go ahead and drag this and drop this into NetBeans real quick. And you'll see here that somehow we've got a problem here. We've got to go back real quick and let's debug and see what happened. Something didn't seem to work right with our constructor. We actually complete that constructor. Let's see here. Ah, yes, we didn't complete the constructor here. All right, so let's go back and fill this in real quick. I thought I had already done this. That's a pretty simple thing to do. In this case, it's going to be this.id is equal to ID. This.firstName is going to be equal to first name. This.lastName equal to last name. And this.age is going to be equal to age. Now, we do want to do some better error checking here, and that's actually where I had left this. And we'll come back to this. We'll have some more conversation about this in a later video. But in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to assume that the user did, in fact, actually give us valid information. It is actually an interesting example here to see what happens when we, in fact, do not actually initialize our property. So you see here we got a null value for each one of these, and that is because these were all declared up here, but they were in fact not initialized. And the only thing that we did actually get out of that was the initialization of our status. Okay, and so ultimately that's the reason why we ended up with the status of active. All right, so let's go ahead and build this one more time. Let's come back out here to the command line. Let's run it one more time. And we'll type in G. Myers. And we'll put in the age. And then you'll see there's my users.csv. And one of the advantages of opening NetBeans is that when you click back to the tab, it'll actually refresh. And there you go. There's your information. Now, let's run this one more time. And this time we're just going to put in some fake information. And if you come back here now, you'll notice that I have overwritten my first user. So we want to avoid that because the idea is that we want to save the information about all of the users, not just the current user. And so what we can do now is we can come back over here to our fundamentals driver.java, and where we are opening the file, what we want to do is we want to take a look at that constructor, and we want to specify whether we want to append it. So in this case, we're going to add the true as the second argument. So this true means append. And then we go ahead and build it one more time. And let's run it. And this time we're going to do my information one more time. And now when we look at our users.csv, you actually have 2 users in there. So now we see how we can append users into the file. Now you may not always want to append. Sometimes you do want to in fact do an overwrite. We're actually going to see how we would go about doing that. But that's where we're going to stop this video. I wanted you to see how you would write to a file. Then what we'll do in additional videos is we'll look about how to read and how to parse it, but then also how ultimately to write multiple values, okay, multiple users. And what we're going to do is we're going to leverage the static methods inside of our user.java to be able to accomplish this. So if you've got any questions or comments, don't hesitate to email me. And as always, thank you for watching.